Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. So today we have a guest. Our guest is Gregory Salmieri. So Greg is a senior scholar of philosophy at the Salem Center at the University of Texas in Austin. Those of you who are around objectivism know him as one of the most prominent objectivist scholars. He has edited the companion to Ayn Rand together with Alan Gotthelf, and more recently, the book Foundations of a Free Society, which is a book that looks at the political philosophy of Ayn Rand. And this is edited with Robert Mayhew. So Greg is interested not only on the philosophy, obviously, but also on the applications of it. And I'm trying to understand society in general and where we've been and where we're going from an objectivist point of view, let's say. So this is why today we're going to discuss a topic which is a bit out of the blue, you would say. So we're going to try to figure out what have been the most important things happening in the last approximately 40 years. So what are the key moments that have influenced where we are going? And when I say we, I mean the United States and the West in general. So we talk about many things like, the rise of the left, postmodernism, or was it 9/11? So we're going to try a bit more specifically to see what are the key moments that, if not determined, really influenced where we found ourselves today. And also we have with us, of course, Mark Pellegrino. So Mark is someone who is living this history by being part of it, and he's going to also help us discuss the key moments in the last 4 decades. And I hope that, again, we're not only recording it, but by recording it, we're going to be able to make history in the future. But first, we need to understand what happened. So, Greg, we were part of a workshop, so to speak, that you organized the last weekend. And first of all, can you tell us a bit, why is it important for you at this stage in time to take this, in a way, bird's eye view, to zoom out a bit and see the last 40 years, the big picture?
Well, this really started for me when I was thinking about a companion to Ayn Rand and what chapters we wanted in it. And that we wanted the book to be broader than a book on Ayn Rand's politics. It was supposed to, broader than a book just on her philosophy as a philosophical system that's timeless, but as a book about what she did as an author. She wrote novels, she wrote essays on events of her time. So it was supposed to be a companion to her corpus. And a lot of what she did was write about what was going on. Right? She wrote all these topical essays, and so I wanted to have a chapter in there that was about them. And we tried to get different people to write it, and people didn't want to take on the task, or some did and found they couldn't do it. And John Lewis took it on, and he and I were working together on it with me as his editor, and he passed away. So it kind of fell to me to finish it. But what was interesting to me is she definitely had a narrative of the time period she was writing about. As she was writing about it, it wasn't just this guy's bad and this guy's good, and I could read it off the philosophy abstractly and looking at the person. There was also like, what's happening to the world? What's happening to the culture such that this figure arose now, and that he did this now it would have been bad anytime he did it, but it was worse now than it would have been 20 years earlier, or better now. And so just what people talk about losing the plot when they're looking at politics or finding the plot. And so I think she had a kind of plot, a kind of causal understanding of what was happening. And that really pervaded her writing about the events of her time. And I don't think many of us thinking about things now from an objectivist perspective have so much of a narrative and have given that much thought to it, or at least I thought there wasn't that much going on in the 90s when I kind of came up and was learning this. So I wanted to kind of first get clearer on her sense of the period she lived through. And then that naturally suggests the question of, is her story right? And also like how do you bring it, or a revised version of it, forward to now? Where are we in history? And so I've been thinking about that a lot. And then now we've had the last couple of elections, and what's happened, after them, everybody seems to think are super important. I do too, are big turning points. But then you want to have that in context. Well, from what to what, what's actually going on here?
So, gentlemen, shall we go decade by decade, or shall we go by, let's say, politics, ethics, epistemology? What are the big developments?
I think maybe go by time makes more sense, because the developments in one area are going to be so related to the developments in another, I think. I don't know that you can separate them.
Okay. So let's say we find ourselves at the beginning of this timeline. We're in 1971. So we have, in the previous decade, we've had the civil rights movement, major step in the history of the United States with its goods and the things that are not perfect. Then we had the Vietnam War, which is huge for two reasons. One is the first big defeat of the United States. Defeat, first of all, at the level of shall I say, self-esteem, image of the superpower, but also we have a revolt from within the United States against anything that the United States stand for. And there's an interesting poem by the beatnik author Ginsberg, not our Razi, the other Ginsberg, who talks about, I think, sorry?
Ruth Bader, or is there a third?
No, the other one. Anyway, so basically take any Ginsberg poem and you will see this disdain for the United States. Disdain when it comes to morality, when it comes to culture, when it comes to the economy, when it comes to foreign policy, everything. And then at the beginning of the 70s also, we have the financial, not crisis, but economy slowing down. We have the oil crisis, and this is where we find ourselves. So let's begin there. So could we say that at that point, United States is at a low, they're at the nadir, or maybe the nadir is today, and that was just, anyway, but in a way, it reminds us the time that we have now. The new left being out in the streets, seemingly winning the narrative, and the United States being at the point where it feels like decline. So let's start from there. Any of you can jump in with any comments you want.
Yeah, so one thought is, I think we really have to keep that time period and the really troubling events of it and cultural state we were in at that time as context when thinking about what happened since, because arguably we're there or worse right now. We can argue about that. But if we want to think about that, we certainly were in a better position in the late 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, in the early 2000s. This kind of thing wasn't happening or wasn't happening as much. So there's some kind of wave or cyclical phenomenon here, right? I don't mean to say it always has to go in a cycle, but it's not like, there's been a trajectory all in one direction since 1776 or 1950 or whatever, time period you want to fix on. So I just want to mention a couple of things leading into the period you mentioned. So after World War II, we have the Republicans essentially accept the New Deal, right? So we have a period where there's not going to be any pushing back on the New Deal. The Kennedy administration, at least as Rand sees it, is kind of focused on removing ideology from politics so that we're only arguing about particular measures out of context rather than broad principles like freedom or government control. Under the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, in addition to getting into the Vietnam War, which you mentioned, we have the mostly socialization of American medicine. That is the passage of the Medicare and also the Kiefer-Harris amendments to the Food and Drug Act. And England and Canada socialized their medicine. England a little earlier, Canada a little later. So mostly socialized medicine. And a lot of a real upshot in antitrust persecutions of business. So when Rand comes on the scene, she sees us as kind of cascading towards dictatorship, or not cascading, but drifting very quickly in that direction. And then you have the 1964 presidential election where you have a Republican who's seen as strong and bold in opposition, or as radical anyway, in opposition to the Kennedy-Johnson administration. Of course, Kennedy was killed, and that's another important part of this history. But anyway, and from Rand's perspective, at least, he has nothing to say. He has no principles to offer. He portrays himself as pro-American and anti-communist and so forth, but he doesn't have much to say about what's wrong with what the current administration is doing and what the alternatives are. And from her view, that failure to articulate any alternative to the vision that was coming from the left, he didn't articulate one, and he lost in a landslide, being perceived as opposed to the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, ushered in this kind of acceleration of the growth of the mainstreaming of what you might call those anti-American, anti-institution attitudes. And you start to see all the protests on campuses and so forth. So that's how she read that time period. And her read of it was that by the early 70s, even without having a vision to counteract that, the American people were just kind of freaked out by the freakiness of the hippies, what happened at the 1968 Democratic Convention, McGovern's kind of embrace of new leftist kind of figures or seeming embrace of them, the kind of weird policy he endorsed of what's now become popular among almost everyone, but which is a minimum basic income, but a minimum basic income that was really pegged to the idea of redistributing wealth, and that was not that much lower than what he thought of as the highest allowable income. So a real kind of egalitarianism. And people reacted against all that. McGovern lost in a landslide to Nixon, who basically no one liked. At least that was her read on that period. So it was not a pro-Nixon or pro-conservative or pro-Republican, but just this has gone too far. We don't want this. And that created a period where there was now room for an alternative to grow. The brakes were put on the progress the culture was making in that direction, and there was time to articulate a new alternative and to rally behind it. But from her view, that space got filled up by the tying of the alternative, the tying of any kind of individualism or free market to religion.
Time out. Before we go to the new right and the religious right, so we discussed a bit politics. Now let's go to the part of culture. Mm-hmm. So Mark, not only from recollections, if you have from the 70s, but being at the center of the culture today, would you think that the counterculture of the 60s indeed set the tempo for the United States from what came after? So this, in a way, relativism, this just peace, we're all friends, and this experimentation and this idea that we're also all countercultural radicals. So no matter if you're a millionaire in Hollywood or if you are a hippie, the cool thing is to be a countercultural, to be against the man.
Well, I mean, more than a declarative statement, I think I have questions related to all these observations. It seems to me that the 60s marked the birth of the new left, right? And the new left took on a different cast. I guess I'm sort of saying this with not a great deal of knowledge, but wasn't this around the time that Herbert Marcuse wrote Repressive Tolerance, and academia began to take on a different cast? It went from an institution that passed knowledge on to an institution that became politically active, and they sort of embraced Maoist, Leninist ideas of what that activism meant and the way in which they approached narratives. And repressive tolerance, I think, was one of the sort of keystone elements in that advocacy, and it framed the argument going forward with respect to how these political, social, and academic activists looked at the world, and that became a part of our culture then. Now, I just want to know if I'm right, and if this academic movement is what fueled these things, that the pragmatism of the right and the further encroachment, taking advantage of the pragmatism by principled advancement on the left. If this was all fueled by, say, Frankfurt School guys like Marcuse.
I think that stuff had to have played a role, but I'm skeptical of the idea that this was new with the new left. So if you look at the leftists of the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, the idea that we shouldn't, first of all, if you look at Stalin, right, there's no tolerance of free speech there. And if you look at the kind of debates over the Hollywood 10 blacklisted authors and Hollywood types, and you look over the rationalizations of that, and you look at Marxist newspapers of the time, my sense is you get the same line of we need to be able to speak, but we don't free speech for the bourgeois or fascists or capitalists or reactionaries isn't a value or is something we should fight. It's not, again, the consistent thread of everybody who sees themselves as a Marxist or as left of center, but then it's not the consistent thread of everyone who thinks that way after Marcuse either. So that's that idea is part of leftist thinking, and it is part of leftist thinking for a long time, as is the idea of reconceptualizing, or not reconceptualizing, because history is always being reconceptualized, rethought, understood in light of new things. But so the idea of a Marxist take on history in terms of class and power structures, and that's as old as Marx, right? Marx was doing that, and there were tons of Marxist historians. Maybe most historians were Marxist historians in the first half of the 20th century in American and British universities. Anyway, very many of them were. Certainly by the 40s and 50s, that was the case. So what I see as having changed isn't so much intolerance of competing views or trying to get a certain narrative of history, a kind of narrative of history on which America is a force for oppression. What I see as having changed is from the new left to the old, from the old left to the new left, is the old left was pro-worldly success in a way, right? It was, the USSR is going to outproduce us and outstrip us, and they're going to have better technology, and if we move to a communist future, we'll all be rich and have dominion over the earth. Whereas the new left has given up on that, and they think we are going to be, we got Nikos's book on this.
Shameless plug, everything you want to know about the transition from the old left to the new left, the rise of lifestyle activism by yours truly. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, so you can tell the story better, but the new left are more hippies, tread lightly on the earth. It doesn't matter that we're not going to have much practical success. And then related to that is who these lefts are appealing to as their constituencies that they're trying to rile up. So the old left was labor unions, basically, right? It was, the workers are the exploited people. We are going to get the workers together and overthrow the bosses, and so it was all about a labor unionization, and you still see that in some leftists later, but more and more it's racial and sexual minorities that are viewed now as the oppressed groups, because production is not seen as noble as it was seen under Marxism. So the important fact to them isn't that these guys are the producers and they're exploited. It's just these guys are on the bottom of the social ladder. And so they're looking for whoever they is or can be portrayed as in that situation. And so it's racial minorities, gays, countries that aren't, that are victims of colonialism or portrayed as such.
Can I say something on this? Yeah. So in a way, the left was always predominantly part of the upper middle or even upper class already in the US, even before Second War. But what changed is who is their audience. So their audience is not anymore the working class, because the working class now is part of the problem. The working class is these rednecks, people who drive fancy, big cars and shoot guns and all that stuff. That's not the people we want. The people we want is the people who are like us. So you have a more middle class appeal to the left, and the people are now seen as part of the problem, not as part of the solution. The other thing related to what Mark said about the universities. So yes, they were always in a way dominated by the left, but in a way that was way less visible than today. Let me give one example. So Berkeley, that today would consider the most radical institution. The person who founded the Department of Sociology of Berkeley and its first chairman was Robert Nisbet. Robert Nisbet was a conservative sociologist, a good one, but a conservative, one of the very few. It would be completely unimaginable in the 90s or the 2000s or today that Berkeley would have a faculty member, not the chairman, who is a conservative. So indeed, there is this idea that there's this march through the institution by the left, but again, it's not new. It has been there forever. By the way, I think an idea, and Razi can text me, can write in the chat if he agrees. Maybe we could do this decade by decade per week, because there's no chance. We are 20-something minutes in and we're already in the beginning of the 70s. There's no chance we're going to get to 2021. So Razi, if you are on board, maybe we can discuss doing this, let's say a weekly thing, of course, or whenever Greg is available. Sure, with a smiley. That's very rare.
I can do it every week, but I'm happy to come back and talk about other decades that we don't get to hear.
Okay, yeah, not every week, but at some point. Okay, so how about then this? I think that in the 70s, the most big shift is the rise of the environmental, politically, the rise of the environmental narrative. And it was also mentioned in the workshop we were this weekend. And it's important for two reasons. A, because it signifies this monumental shifts in the left, that it's not anymore the champion of industrial production, and it's not anymore that capitalism is bad because it produces a lot. Now we move the goalpost completely. Now capitalism is bad, not because it produces not enough. Now capitalism is bad because it produces too much. But also the unknown, let's say the unknown fact is that at the beginning of the environmentalism, it is engulfed and it is, let's say, sanctioned by the right. So the conservation movement in the United States is predominantly right, conservative before the 60s. If you see the history of the Earth First, of radical environmentalism, you can find many, quote, rednecks in it. And who is the first person who sanctioned and celebrated Earth Day in the United States? Of course, Nixon. So today you're going to find many conservatives say watermelons, the Greens, they're green on the outside and red on the inside. The right was also confident in jumping on the environmental narrative, particularly because they haven't got much else. So the right hasn't got...
in the UK, right?
Sorry?
Thatcher in England also, right?
Thatcher in England, yes. So Thatcher had... So based which conservative you ask, the Green conservative is going to tell you, no, Thatcher was a big proponent of the environment, but more fancy, like cool conservative kids, they're going to tell you, no, Thatcher was already back then against climate change. Okay, so what else is there to see in the 70s? Shall we say that the Iran crisis, it's 79, right?
Yeah.
So we go from Vietnam, then we go to Carter, to Nixon. So defeat in Vietnam continues. The disaster in Vietnam spreads out. Then we have Cambodia. Then we have also the Laos. So the defeat is not only a defeat in Vietnam, but leads to the disaster in Cambodia. And at the same time, we have one of the most important political developments of these 40 years, which is the rise of political Islam. And where is this more evident? In Iran. And there in Iran, we have the unthinkable, a new regime, a revolutionary regime. And by the way, the Iranian revolution was a true revolution in terms of, if you see the percentage of population who participates, it was very enthusiastically endorsed. So it was a real revolution. And we see the unthinkable, keeping hostages of the superpower for many months. So why is this so important? It was brought by many people during that workshop, and I think by you.
Yeah, I would mention one other thing, or two other things in the 70s before we get to the. So one is, I already mentioned this, important in Rand's view, the public's reaction against what it saw as growing leftism in the electing of Nixon twice, and then also Watergate, which was a really, the first time a president was forced to resign, basically, or pushed into resigning, almost impeached, a real scandal, a real crisis of confidence in leadership. But yeah, I think that the Iranian Revolution is bigger in its historical tales than Watergate. So it's the beginning of a new enemy we don't know how to fight. Carter's response to it is lame. I mean, doesn't do anything. Reagan is sort of seen as a tough guy and talks a little bit tougher, but also, doesn't really do much there, and then is engaged in selling arms to the Iranians, right? Later, covertly in exchange for hostages.
The Contras. So for people who don't know this was a deal so Reagan wanted to support the anti-left guerrillas in Nicaragua, the Contras. So because he cannot directly support the Contras, he goes through Iran, which Iran only some years ago was holding hostages the personnel of the US embassy, some of the personnel. And its rallying rallying chant, how it's called, was "Death to America." So Khomeini is still in charge when we have the Iran Contras scandal. So go on.
Yeah, so there's Reagan, in effect, covertly supporting this regime or having them as part of his. Anyway, the Reagan administration, exactly how it worked out is, still a little murky. But it was some kind of administration policy to work with the Iranian sub rosa. And it was a real blow, particularly in the wake of Vietnam. It seemed like we couldn't accomplish anything, right? And like we were on the run in the world, and like we were weak. And I think in some ways starting in the 70s and in some ways starting in the 80s, I think we start to see a revival of a feeling like America is a country that can do things and like America is good. The people who have this narrative of America as a horrible, evil country, they're still there, but they're sort of marginalized culturally. And the fact of our defeat in Vietnam and our basically unassertiveness in the face of the hostage crisis remains still there. But we have some minor military victories in Grenada and so forth. We have Reagan with assertive rhetoric against the Russians. We have in the 90s, the Berlin Wall comes down and communism falls, right? And now we're the world's only superpower. There's the first Iraq war where the American military seems very, very mighty, especially as compared to a military using Soviet weapons. And so on the foreign policy strength, ability to project strength abroad, America starts looking much more assertive. And you get a kind of deregulatory push in a lot of industries, energy, transportation, to some minor extent, finance in the 70s, something that's really decried by the current leftist narrative of what happened. But one result, it seems, of that is a booming economy in America, and in particular, the ability of Silicon Valley to really blow up, the ability of the tech industry to really become commercialized and become huge in America. And then at the same time, or around the same time, late 70s, you have increased freedom, the kind of giving up of communism, basically, in China. China still is an authoritarian, awful government, but they're trying to have market economies and so forth after Mao. And India is also becoming more capitalistic, and these places becoming manufacturing hubs, people getting lifted out of poverty, the world economy globalizing, which is a real move towards capitalism. And these things, despite being often stated as bad for America or bad for American workers by leftists at the time and rightists now, are I think keep America strong economically during this period and create a real rise in standard of living, or at least a preventing of our standard of living from becoming depressed.
Right. Okay. I've asked too many questions. So, Mark, as they say in court drama, the witness is yours.
I don't know what to make of any of this. What I get from this picture is this undulating cycle of two sides who, one side in particular, the right doesn't quite know what it's doing, but of a back and forth struggle where periodically one side has ascendancy and the other side, and then the other side sort of rises up. I'm not getting a coherent sense of what intellectual things are happening. What's the spirit of the moment that's animating this sort of one crisis after another that's peppered by successes. It seems to me that after years of being worn down by progressives and Marxists, so to speak, in the institutions, the right sort of split itself off from principle. They politically speaking, they just divorced themselves from principle. and I might be jumping ahead to where we stand now, perhaps, and the left's cognizance of the failure of Marxism and their resultant rebellion in postmodernism sort of gives us this perfect storm of anti-intellectualism. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It seems to predominate today, but I'm not quite getting the picture of what all these losses and successes amount to be.
One thing that you would expect to happen, if you want to zoom out even from where we are, right? And I think zooming out means zooming out past a contrast between right and left, and also means zooming out past a contrast between this decade and that, at the level of the 70s versus 80s or something. There's we're a country that was founded on a pro-reason, pro-individual ideology. And that's baked into our basic constitution, our laws, with all sorts of contradictions and compromises and problems, some of which got better and some of which got worse. But basically, a society that's for the individual's pursuit of his own happiness and voluntary exchanges to facilitate that, and laws that are meant to make that possible. And that created that's what created an industrial revolution. It's what created a rising standard of living. It's what creates a pressure for the correction of the various forms of unfreedom that we had, inequality under the law and so forth, the worst of which being slavery, but there having been others as well. But all of those ideas require as their basis, right? This is Ayn Rand's broad picture of history, valuing of reason and a valuing of the self. And these are two kind of Enlightenment ideas that were not well defended in the Enlightenment and really came under attack after it, so that you have a kind of mysticism and altruism and collectivism as an axis of ideas that are leading to the undoing and the unraveling of America and of the American influence abroad that's led to the greater freedom in other countries. But that kind of thing doesn't happen all at once and doesn't happen overnight, right? You have the tremendous success of American capitalism and American freedom leading to a kind of cultural dominance that leads to it being spreaded and adopted abroad, Japan, China, India, and this is kind of continuing. At the same time as you have its foundations being undermined, and you have people not having self-conscious ideas that can support or defend what makes America what makes America great, but who have a feeling of life that's kind of attuned to Americanism, both in America and in everywhere in the world where they're kind of ingesting American culture. So what happens? You have the ideas, the explicit ideas corroding things, leading to movements and political movements that lead to catastrophe. But then you have a kind of break on that in people's sense of, this isn't us. This isn't what we can be. We can't be Kent State and people rioting in the streets, and that's not America. We have to push back against that. But not knowing how to push back against it. So when they see some kind of obvious juggernaut of awfulness, they're, no, we don't want that. But then they don't have an alternative. So there's something that puts on the brakes and leads to some steps back from the unraveling, and think of the kind of excesses of the hippie movement as having done that. You could also think of the excesses of corruption in the Nixon administration and in Watergate getting exposed as having done that. We don't want the executive to be so powerful. We want more checks on it, right? So it's just left in many different factors. The culture has been getting less intellectual, less pro-freedom, but then some horror happened as a result of that, and people push back against that. But the pushback is often good, but it's not good enough to get us really going in the opposite direction fully. And so you can think of what's happening in different areas of life in the 70s and in the 80s as a kind of retrenchment towards Americanism, but kind of inarticulately. But it's enough that things are getting better. And there's already positive momentum in lots of areas. So a little bit more freedom, or a little bit of a pullback on the brakes, or on the anti-freedom forces, can let the entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley and all the small business people all across the country and everything else get a lot done, inspire a lot of people in China, inspire a lot of people in India, and make life a lot better for a lot of people. But these anti-enlightenment forces remain in the culture, and they remain whittling us down and weakening us. And then when something happens that's then a shock to us and makes us really question whether we're good and powerful and right, they'll come out of the woodwork again and become more and more with a renewed virulence. And I think the aftermath of 9/11 was the next thing that gave those kind of cultural forces a opportunity to reassert themselves. 9/11
before we go to that, actually we haven't got time, but we do have a super chat which I want to address. By the way, the poem about the America's disdain for itself is by Allen Ginsberg with S, and it's not like our Razi, and it's called America, and it's disgusting, but it's the most, like, if the 1960s were a poem, it would be America by Ginsberg. Anyway, here's a super chat question. Thank you very much, by the way, to our viewer who has the super chat. So the question is about what the term narrative means, because it's a term I use often, maybe other people use often as well. So very quickly, the way I understand narrative is what is the story we tell and the story that gets dominant to explain a situation. Let me give you an example. In 2008, we have the financial crisis. One narrative, which means one story, one way of understanding it is that it was, quote, neoliberalism, greed, and deregulation. And unfortunately, that's the narrative that wins. An alternative narrative would be that, no, this was state intervention and all that stuff. So narrative means what is the story that prevails in the minds of the people in the public sphere. And there are contrasting narratives. So we have our narrative, doesn't win. But usually narrative, we talk about the prevailing story that wins. Okay, so outro. So, okay, today was a bit in a good way disorganized in terms that we didn't finish. And but we will continue at some other week. So things to notice. First of all, we continue in Clubhouse, where Greg is quite active from what I see. So if you want to ask questions about ideally that period, but any other burning questions you want, you can join us in Clubhouse. So Razi also says, okay, and also one more thing. If you appreciate the work that we're doing, and we are doing more stuff, more and more stuff, consider becoming a member of the Ayn Rand Center UK. So you get access to programs and events that are not open to the general public, mostly diving deep into philosophy, diving deep into the Leonard Peikoff courses, the Productivity Hub. You get access to our many WhatsApp groups where we discuss everything from fitness to sports, politics, general stuff, a lot of stuff, art, and I'm sure I'm forgetting more and more things. And apparently there's more stuff. And at 9 p.m. UK time today on Clubhouse, Zoe and Razi discuss something. So Razi discussed with Zoe Strimple from The Telegraph, I think Stackhouse, which is one of the new big things, let's say, on the sphere of ideas. Substack, yes. Okay, so too much information for people to chew. The Crow epistemology might kick in. If you want to know what the Crow epistemology is, join our Saturday sessions or read Ayn Rand and the books that Greg has edited, particularly the companion to Ayn Rand. Okay, we move to Clubhouse. Many thanks, Mark. Many thanks, Greg. Many thanks to our viewers.
Thanks,
we're going to see you all there in a minute. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Clubhouse.